Nigel Farage positions himself as a staunch advocate for the British public, sharpening his critique of Keir Starmer's leadership and policies with the urgency of national interests at stake. Farage accuses Starmer of making illogical and damaging decisions within his first 100 days in office, decisions that undermine the country's well-being and leave the public increasingly frustrated. Presenting himself as a genuine voice for the people, Farage connects with voters in places like Clacton, addressing their pressing concerns about immigration, an issue where he claims successive governments, especially Labour, have failed to deliver real solutions. His message resonates with citizens disillusioned by political promises that consistently fall short, leaving communities to shoulder the burdens of unchecked migration. Farage takes direct aim at Labour's latest proposal, led by Yvette Cooper, to deport thousands of illegal immigrants by the end of the year. Though it may seem ambitious on the surface, Farage dismisses the plan as a pipe dream, arguing that Labour lacks both the will and the competence to bring it to fruition. He asserts that the party's repeated failures on immigration reflect deeper issues of lost control and broken trust, particularly in the post-Brexit landscape, where the public expected sovereignty to be restored. According to Farage, Labour's handling of immigration betrays the very principles of Brexit, with policies that, in his view, allow mass migration to persist unchecked. He casts doubt on Starmer's commitment to meaningful change, suggesting that his inaction signals passive acceptance of the status quo, further eroding public confidence. Nigel Farage delves deeper into the UK's housing crisis, emphasising that this issue extends far beyond the realm of immigration and touches the very fabric of public well-being. While immigration and population growth contribute to the rising demand for housing, Farage warns that the country's current response is inadequate. He points out that although the UK manages to build between 200,000 and 250,000 homes annually, this number barely scratches the surface of what is required to meet the growing need. The problem, he argues, is not just about building more houses, but about creating sustainable communities. Many of these new housing developments are being hastily constructed, driven by the urgent demand for accommodation. However, this rapid expansion is not accompanied by the necessary infrastructure, such as schools, healthcare facilities, and roads, leaving communities overcrowded and residents frustrated with the lack of essential services. Farage uses the example of Clacton, a town that exemplifies the challenges many areas across the UK are facing. With its public services stretched thin, Clacton struggles to accommodate the influx of new residents, many of whom feel the impact of overwhelmed schools, long waits at clinics, and congested roads. The situation has reached a point where the quality of life for both new arrivals and long-term residents is deteriorating, creating a sense of discontent within the community. Farage warns that if the government fails to rethink its approach, towns like Clacton could face severe social and economic consequences. He cautions that ignoring the need for balanced development will alienate residents even further, fostering a sense of abandonment among communities that feel overlooked by policymakers. For Farage, the key to addressing the housing crisis lies not just in building more homes, but in ensuring that these developments are supported by the infrastructure and public services necessary to create livable, thriving communities. Without this, he predicts, towns across the UK will be heading toward disaster, with local populations growing increasingly resentful toward a government that appears indifferent to their struggles. Nigel Farage has intensified his criticism of the UK's growing reliance on foreign labour, singling out the healthcare sector as a prime example of what he describes as the government's neglect of domestic workforce development. According to Farage, the UK has failed to adequately train its own citizens to fill essential roles such as doctors, nurses, and care workers, resulting in a chronic labour shortage that has forced the nation to recruit professionals from overseas. He argues that this dependency is not only a policy failure, but also an erosion of the country's ethos of self-sufficiency, leaving vital sectors vulnerable to international labour markets. Farage further contends that the practice of hiring healthcare workers from nations grappling with their own staff shortages is morally questionable, describing it as a double betrayal, one that undermines both the UK's national interests and the stability of those foreign healthcare systems. Looking ahead to the next general election, Farage predicts immigration control will dominate political discourse, becoming a decisive factor for voters frustrated by what he sees as unchecked migration. He proposes bolstering the country's border security by deploying more police officers to patrol entry points, but he acknowledges that implementing stricter immigration measures faces significant legal hurdles. Chief among these, he claims, is the influence of the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR. Farage criticizes the ECHR for blocking key immigration policies, pointing specifically to its role in halting deportation flights to Rwanda as an example of external interference in domestic governance. He argues that the UK must extricate itself from the jurisdiction of the ECHR to regain full control over its immigration policy. Only by severing these legal constraints, Farage insists, can the country secure its borders, restore national sovereignty, and implement effective governance in the interests of the British people. In a recent interview, Nigel Farage doubled down on his defense of his close alliance with Donald Trump, asserting that many of Trump's once controversial remarks, initially dismissed or mocked, have been vindicated over time. Farage pointed to key issues, including the economy, immigration, and foreign policy, to argue that Trump's unconventional stances, far from being baseless, were ahead of their time and have since resonated with growing public sentiment. On the topic of faith, Farage criticized the ridicule often aimed at people who believe in divine intervention, contending that dismissing their beliefs undermines the personal strength and resilience many individuals draw from their faith, particularly in turbulent times. Turning his attention to domestic politics, Farage launched a scathing critique of Labour leader Keir Starmer, accusing him of indecisiveness and a chronic reluctance to confront the nation's most pressing challenges. He argued that Starmer's handling of immigration reflects a wider failure within the Labour Party to govern with purpose and resolve, leaving the country adrift at a time when decisive leadership is crucial. Farage cited recent immigration statistics as evidence of Labour's inability to honour its promises, warning that the current influx is merely the tip of a larger governance crisis. He suggested that the party's unwillingness to articulate a clear plan signals deeper dysfunction, exacerbating the public's frustration and eroding trust in the government's ability to manage critical issues. Throughout his political career, Farage framed himself as a champion of meaningful reform, reminding voters of the influence smaller, determined parties can wield in forcing change. He urged the public to support parties willing to tackle uncomfortable truths and address the systemic issues driving public discontent. Farage warned that unless Starmer steps up or is replaced, the pattern of inaction will persist and the Labour Party will continue to fall short of its promises. With biting rhetoric, Farage concluded that meaningful change would remain out of reach for as long as Starmer holds power, leaving the nation vulnerable to prolonged crises and missed opportunities for reform. In conclusion, Nigel Farage positions himself as a politician determined to confront pressing issues head-on, blending sharp criticism with a firm commitment to overhaul policies that, in his view, have fallen short. Farage's rhetoric taps into the growing frustration among citizens who feel abandoned by mainstream parties and disillusioned by years of unfulfilled promises. His message strikes a chord, particularly with those seeking bold and immediate action on key issues such as immigration control, affordable housing shortages, and the restoration of national sovereignty in an era of increasing global interdependence. Farage's approach appeals to voters who believe the political establishment has lost touch with everyday concerns, framing him as both a voice of reason and resistance in a divisive political landscape. Whether you see his stance as necessary reform or divisive rhetoric, his arguments continue to spark debate. What do you think of Farage's vision for the future? Does his agenda resonate with you, or do you see it as more polarizing than practical? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay informed on the latest developments shaping politics nationwide.